Morning, everyone. So I just want to kind of discuss some of the geochronology and geochemistry results from the GP2 program. We've actually collected quite a large data set from the different lithologies in the GP2 area, but for this talk I want to focus specifically on the data we've collected from the mafic samples. And just generally speaking, that obviously tells us something about mafic magmatism tectonics, but also the nickel, copper, platinum group element potential of the region. And I'd just like to acknowledge all the folks on the slide here who have helped with the project as well. So I guess just on that topic of nickel potential, we know that magmatic nickel copper sulfides occur in the Western Gawler. As an example, in the Fowler domain over here, in this TMI map, is the relatively well-known Sahara prospect where there's active exploration going on for nickel. Over to the east, there's a series of different nickel prospects and areas of interest as well in the Harris Greenstone Belt, which actually also hosts various basaltic rocks and the Lake Harris Komatiite, which I'll discuss in a bit more detail as well. But I guess in terms of exploring the nickel copper PGE potential further, particularly in this kind of central Gawler region here, our aim with the project has been twofold, which is one, place temporal constraints on mafic magmatism, and also I guess explore the source compositions of a series of different mafic intrusions as well. And I think importantly, these two data sets, they obviously inform us about the regional tectonic framework of the region, which is something I'll hopefully address at the kind of back end of the talk. So we've collected quite a lot of samples, mafic samples for geochemical analysis, about 100, and also a much smaller proportion we've targeted for zircon shrimp work. And the mafic samples come from 5 different locations: Aristarchus, Scoos Hill, over at Acacia East, just to the southwest of the Tarcoola Goldfield, and also up in the northwest Christie domain in the Mobella region. And the sample numbers here on the TMI are just those samples we've targeted for zircon work. So I just wanted to briefly kind of go through a simplified geological context. This is something that Claire spoke about earlier in much more detail, which is the Archean to early Paleoproterozoic Mulgathan complex. And I've tried to highlight its kind of spatial distribution here on this map in yellow. But just to emphasize some of the primary units we're interested in, particularly the mafic rocks, from oldest to youngest, there's the calc-alkaline bimodal Devil's Playground volcanics at 2555 MA. They actually occur just off the east, off the map here. There's also the metasedimentary Christie gneiss, which has been spoken about a lot today. Over in the Harris Greenstone Belt, there's the Lake Harris Komatiite at about 2520 MA. And if we go to the Aristarchus prospect, there's the 2490 Bird and Metagabbro as well, which I'll speak about a bit more later on. Also at the Aristarchus prospect is a newly recognised felsic unit called the Aurora Tank Suite, and it actually occurs also up at Acacia East. And I guess the interpretation with the Aurora Tank Suite is that it was emplaced at the onset of the Slaffordian orogeny from about, the Slaffordian orogeny is about 2475 to 2410 MA, and this metamorphosed the Mulgathan complex protoliths to granulite facies conditions. So the kind of interpretation is that the protoliths of the Mulgathan complex developed in a back arc basin setting, presumably driven by sustained mantle thermal input, and then that facilitated mafic magmatism at 2520 MA, the Lake Harris Komatiite, and also at 2490 MA, the Bird and Metagabbro at Aristarchus. And just thinking about the kind of regional tectonic framework, one of the questions that we've tried to address with this new GP2 isotopic data is how does the mafic magmatism recorded at these different locations in the kind of central Gawler region fit into this existing tectonic interpretation from the literature. So just moving on to the geochronology, essentially what we've done is recovered both magmatic ages and metamorphic ages from a series of different mafic intrusions in the region. The magmatic ages I've given by these pink coloured bars here, metamorphic ages in blue. So this is the Scoos Hill region where we've dated 3 samples of what's called the Scoos Hill metaproxenite. It's a pretty highly amphibolized lithology. You can see the photomicrograph here. There's a lot of amphibole and biotite floating around. And you can see from this plot that most of the ages, they're blue. They are actually in agreement with this Leffortian orogeny, so that's their metamorphic ages. But we did recover a magmatic crystallization age for one sample, which came out at 2469 MA. Just for reference, these lighter coloured bars here, that's just kind of some existing reconnaissance ages for the metaproxenite. At the Aristarchus prospect is a unit called the Aristarchus metaprototite. Again, there's a lot of late amphibole similar to Scoos Hill, but there's also relic magmatic clinopyroxene in the sample. We've collected 2 samples to date here, and we've recovered ages of 2467 and 2479 MA, which are within uncertainty of one another. And I've just put the age for the Burden metagabbro, which I've mentioned, 2490 MA, and then there's also about a 2474 age for the Aurora Tank Suite granite, which is in the Aristarchus area. It's a little bit more complicated at Acacia East. There are a series of metagabbroic lithologies, but unfortunately they only record Leffortian metamorphic ages. However, we did attain a Charnakitic lithology, which you can see here from this photograph, occurs as these patches that are hosted by the metagabbros in the area. And these gave 2470 zircon ages, which is obviously in agreement with the Aurora Tank Suite. It's not really clear at this point whether those 2470 ages are metamorphic, are magmatic, or because they could potentially be inherited. But I think the simplest interpretation is probably that given the metagabbros at Acacia East are actually interlayered, you can see here with the felsic gneiss from the Aurora Tank Suite, therefore the metagabbros are probably about 2470 MA. And just over to the southwest of Tarcoola, there are iron sulfide bearing mafic intrusives. One particular sample gave an age of 2471 MA. So this is a plot that Claire showed earlier, just to summarize those ages. So if we take all the magmatic crystallization ages from the different intrusions, they give us a pooled weighted mean age of 2470 MA, consistent with the Aurora Tank Suite. And so, one conclusion, therefore, we can draw at this point is that the Aurora Tank Suite is not solely a felsic unit, but actually a bimodal unit, given those ages from the mafic rocks. So just moving on to the geochemical results. I won't go into the details of the kind of background here, but, we know that mantle heterogeneity has long been recognised in the Gawler from various different studies. Just as an example, I mentioned the Devil's Playground volcanics at 2555 MA. They represent evidence in the region for an Archean metasomatized mantle source, and there's also at 2520 MA, the Lake Harris komatiite is evidence for a depleted mantle source in the region. So the question here then becomes, in the early Paleoproterozoic, what are the source characteristics of those younger mafic intrusives at 2490 MA, the Burden metagabbro at Aristarchus, and also those 2470 mafic intrusives that I've grouped here into the Aurora Tank Suite in light of those results from the geochronology. And very broadly speaking, the mafic intrusives are tholitic and komatitic basalts, just according to these discrimination plots here. They have relatively low silica values, below 55 weight percent, and kind of moderate to high magnesium numbers. But importantly, this is something I'll go through in the next couple of slides. Their trace element and rare earth element trends distinguish 3 compositional groups encompassing the different ages and regions. So the different ages being 2490 and 2470 MA, and then these different regions which I went through earlier. So the first compositional group we've identified, we've just called Group 1. And this is represented by the 2490 Burden Metagabbro at Aristarchus and the 2470 mafics at Acacia East. And you can see from these plots here where we have the trace elements on the far left down to light rare earths and heavy rare earths, that the trends are quite flat. Trace elements and rare earth element trends are quite flat, and we get a depletion in the light rare earths here. So their trends are actually quite similar to EMORB, which I've given in yellow here, and NMORB in red. And I've also got on these plots the average compositions for the Devil's Playground volcanics in blue and the Lake Harris komatiite in brown. But I guess these kind of patterns are quite typical for mafic intrusives, and as a consequence of that, we might expect that these compositions or these mafics are therefore potentially derived from a mixed asthenospheric, lithospheric mantle source. So we've identified two more compositional groups, 2A and 2B, and we've done that because their compositions are much more enriched relative to EMORB compared to those group 1 mafics. So this is just what we call group 2A, which is represented by the 2470 aged mafics at Aristarchus, some additional mafics at Acacia East, and also the mafics at Scoos Hill. And you can see their trace element patterns are pretty enriched. They're light rare earth enriched as well. And if I move on to 2B, they're even more enriched in the traces relative to EMORB, and they're light rare earths as well. These ones here are represented by the mafics in the northwest Christian domain and at Tarcoola. And I guess just taking the last two groups, group 2A and 2B, these levels of enrichment are quite atypical for mafics. And so, assuming that there's not an influence here of crustal contamination, which I won't get into because of the time constraints, then, it's possible that potentially the mafics have a lithospheric mantle source. So I guess just summing up those geochemical results, we know now that there are multiple generations of mafic magmatism at 2490 and 2470 MA, and now we see there's evidence of this kind of heterogeneous mantle at 2470 MA as well, with these kind of NMORB, EMORB depleted compositions at Acacia East, and then these much more enriched compositions at these other locations. And we can kind of explore that mantle heterogeneity a bit further with this plot here. For instance, the mafics at Aristarchus and Acacia East, which are represented by these pink polygons here on this plot, they have both, depleted and also enriched compositions, as we've seen, so we can group them together. But on the other hand, at Scoos Hill, the mafics appear to have a lithospheric mantle source, and this is similar to the mafics also at Tarcoola and the northwest Christian domain, except as we've seen, they're much more enriched. And they actually also have quite juvenile initial neodymium isotopic signatures relative to the other mafics in the other localities, which actually suggests these levels of enrichment we're seeing here might be inherent from the source. And yeah, so this is something that Claire talked about earlier, just these kind of northeast-southwest trending structures. So just following on from those geochemical results, at Aristarchus and Acacia East, they sit on this northeast-southwest magnetic grain here, and you can see that's kind of distinct to the mafics at Scoos Hill, which sit on this less obvious grain here. And then you have the mafics in the Mombella region here and over at Tarcoola, which sit outboard of these kind of central Gawler structures here, and obviously define a separate compositional domain as well. So, therefore we might speculate that perhaps these different mantle sources that we've identified here are potentially structurally controlled. Just for the last few slides, I just wanted to conclude by kind of re-emphasising that question I brought up earlier, which is how does the record of mafic magmatism in the region kind of fit into that existing tectonic interpretation. So this here on the slide is just a bit of a cartoon, a tectonic schematic of the development for the Mole-Gaffing complex protoliths, and it's just based on existing interpretations from geochronology and geochemistry in the central Western Gawler region. So if you look at this top panel drawn for about 2560 MA, there's this kind of speculative oceanic arc setting based on the primarily the calc-alkaline character of those Devil's Playground volcanics, 2555 MA, but importantly we get the development of a back-arc basin here as well. At 2520 MA, there's of course the extrusion of the Lake Harris komatiite in the back-arc, and this is possibly driven by shallow subduction of a kind of speculative continental fragment, and then subsequent slab breakoff, which possibly facilitated the influx of kind of melt-bearing mantle at the base of the weakening lithosphere here in the back-arc setting. And then moving on, I guess, to the time frame we're interested in between 2490 and 2460 MA, we see this continued lithospheric extension and weakening at the base of the back-arc, but importantly, again, we observe multiple generations of mafic, of regionally extensive mafic magmatism, represented by the 2490 Burden metagabbro at Aristarchus, and also the 2470 mafic intrusives, which we've grouped now into the Aurora tank suite. And just lastly, maybe the mafic magmatism here was facilitated by these different lithospheric scale structures, and the mafic magma was potentially tapped into these different mantle sources as suggested by those results from the geochemistry. Thank you. Cheers.